All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 7, Section 4, the Constitutional Convention and Federal Constitution. So let us recall that last section, we talked about the first national government of the United States. And that was something called the Articles of Confederation. And to make a long story short, it wasn't a very good government. It was essentially too weak to function. So in this section, we'll talk about the second and actually current constitution or national government, which is simply just referred to as the Constitution. So how do we get from point A, the first national government, to point B, the second and current national government? So amongst all the issues that were plaguing the United States in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, think about the inability to raise taxes, which led to war debts that were not being paid off, veterans who had not received salaries from the war, poor trade, inflated economy, internal armed revolts like Shays' Rebellion. There were a lot of things that were certainly going wrong. And so leaders, sometimes called nationalists or new nationalists, your George Washingtons, your Alexander Hamiltons, and others, began to get together to begin discussing things that could be done. One of these conventions or one of these meetings was the Annapolis Convention in Maryland. This was a meeting to discuss changes to the Articles. However, it wasn't well attended. There were only 5 states represented there. Ultimately, the biggest decision that came out of the Annapolis Convention was to call a different convention in Philadelphia a year later, which would eventually become known as the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitutional Convention was, again, sort of similar, a meeting to discuss the changes to the Articles, but here at the Constitutional Convention, they would actually make the changes. It was at this convention that the second and current Constitution was written. Those individuals who drafted it up, we call them the Founding Fathers. And this one had more representatives there. It was not a, it was not something that was unanimously agreed upon, but the attendance of George Washington there kind of gave it the stamp of approval. That gave it a lot more legitimacy than any other sort of, any meeting without him. And initially they had met at the Constitutional Convention to just make changes. That was initially what they started, but they realized that they would probably just be better off scrapping the whole Articles and just beginning anew, and that's exactly what they did. And so in creating a new government, again, a second government, to replace the old national government of the Articles, which again had failed, it was too weak to function, there were many things that were debated amongst the representatives. There was about 50 or so people from the states. And probably the biggest debate was the question about representation. That is to say, how would the states be represented in the national government? And there were pretty much 2 competing plans for how representation should go. First was the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan was something that was supported by, we'll say, big states. And what we mean by big is not big in terms of territory, but actually big in terms of population, right? That was what they wanted. The Virginia Plan also wanted to create 2 additional branches, the executive and judicial. This would give the new Constitution a nice balanced government, unlike the Articles. Recall that the Articles only had 1 branch of government, that was the legislative branch. There was no president of the United States during the Articles. So the Virginia Plan said, well, let's create 3 branches instead. And in terms of this question of representation, Virginia, or the Virginia Plan, said it would be proportional. In other words, population would equal representation or votes. So the bigger that a state was, the more people that a state had, they would eventually get more votes in the government. This was alarming to the smaller states who wanted the New Jersey plan. This was supported by small states. And they said, wait a minute, if we went by Virginia's plan and only counted votes based off of population, then, votes, I guess, then the small states wouldn't have very much of a say. And instead, New Jersey said, well, each state should get the equal number of votes. So in other words, you can think of their plan as one state equals one vote. They opted, or they promoted, the idea of a unicameral legislative branch. That means one house, as opposed to a two-house plan. Bicameral means two house. Again, typically this meant an upper house and a lower. Typically the lower was more democratic. The upper was a little bit more restrictive in terms of who could participate. And what the smaller states supported also was the ability to regulate commerce and tax. Remember, these were powers denied to the Articles government. Right? Again, these powers were very important to solve the problem of, we'll just say, the economy. Right? Very important there. And as you might imagine, big room, 50 people, big states, small states, all arguing about these things. Eventually, they did come down on a couple of agreements here. The state of Connecticut, or sometimes called simply just the Great Compromise, solved this problem. The creation, or the problem of representation, was solved by creating a bicameral legislative branch. That means two houses. And in those two houses, single letter there, in those two houses, one house would be based off of population, and that would be the House of Representatives. And one of the houses, the Senate, would be based off one state, two votes, right? So in this sense, New Jersey got its way when it came to the Senate, and Virginia got its way when it came to the House of Representatives. So this was kind of this is the way that our Congress is organized today. We have a Senate and a House of Representatives. We each send two representatives to the Senate, no matter how big the state is or how small the state is. California sends two, Wyoming sends two, right? Even though those states are very different in terms of population. In the House of Representatives, there are currently 435 members, I think. And because California is such a big state, it sends like 55, representatives or something like that. Whereas Wyoming only sends one, and that's of course based off of population. For something to become a law, it has to pass both, right? So the House and the Senate have to agree on something. And again, legislature equals Congress. These things together we call Congress. And again, these guys pass the laws. That's the job of what Congress does. Some other things that were agreed upon there, they did agree to give the power to tax. Another thing that was agreed upon was this idea of an executive and judicial branch. So we, of course, got our three branches of government that we have today at the Constitutional Convention. And if we had to pinpoint one person who is the quote-unquote father of the Constitution, we would probably point to James Madison, who was, it was a group project, the Constitution was, but if you had to pinpoint maybe one guy, we could say that James Madison might have been the most influential there, maybe. Now, in addition to representation, another big issue was that of slavery. And in this case, it is the northern states versus the southern states. So it doesn't have to do with big states versus small states this time. It has to do with north over south. Now, an important point to make. There was no talk about the abolition of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. Slavery and the legality of slavery was done on a state level, right? States made laws as they pertain to slavery. However, there was a question about how slaves would be counted as representation. So the big question was, should slaves count as part of the population. We'll say for representation purposes. So, for example, two ways in which population was counted or had consequences. One was in terms of votes when it came to laws, right? So in the House of Representatives, we know that you get as many votes for as many people as your state has. So do slaves count as part of that population? In this case, southern states would say yes. They want to count their slaves because that would give them more votes in the House of Representatives and therefore more political power. Northern states oppose this. But then when it came to something like taxes, taxes were based off population. The bigger your state was, the more taxes that you paid. In this case, the southern states would not want slaves to count because they wouldn't want a heavy tax burden. It'd be opposite or it'd be different for the North. So both sides went back and forth, eventually coming to what's known as the 3/5 compromise, and that is for representation. Slaves count as 3/5 a person. So for example, if let's say, we got Virginia or some sort of slave state, maybe South Carolina, let's say that they have a population of 10,000 people, but they have 5,000 slaves. Well, in terms of the population of Virginia, they would count that, let's see if I can do my math here, as 13,000 people, because you wouldn't count the total 5,000 slaves. You would only count 3/5 of that. So you'd only be counting essentially 3,000 people. And what this did in the long run really was to give, and this is going to be worth noting, this gave slave states more political power. And this would be something that northern states would grow to resent in the future. Now, we had mentioned before that, the leaders, founding father types, wanted to create a government that was, on the one hand, a government that was by the people for the people. So it was democratic, but also didn't want to create one which was too democratic that would lead to anarchy. I had made this illustration before that in creating anarchy, or we'll make mob rule, in creating governments, right? You wanted a government that was, democratic, but not too democratic so that it was anarchy. You wanted something that was, you didn't want to take away too much democracy that it would lead to tyranny, kind of right back to where you started before the American Revolution. And so one of the things that the Constitution looked to do was to really limit democracy in favor of function, right? So again, remember the Articles. The problem was functionality, right? How do we solve everyday problems? Even though the Articles was weak to the point where there was no fear of tyranny, it wasn't working practically. And so in terms of where we went with the Constitution, we went maybe more towards this direction, you might say, towards a more restrictive government. We can see that in the Electoral College. This is the process by which the president is chosen. And it is not a direct democratic vote. And again, this was in the spirit of trying to create a better functioning government than a more democratic government. So that's an important point to note, is that the goal was not necessarily to create the most democratic government, but to create something that was more better at functioning in sort of the very present time period. Lastly, once this document was created, so 55 men sat in Philadelphia, hammered out this document, 3 branches, 3/5 compromise, a House and a Senate, the right to tax, the right to regulate commerce. The big question was, would the public actually accept it? And that's essentially what ratification is. Ratification is, will the public accept. And pretty much they said, well, if 9 out of 13 states agree that the Constitution is good, then we'll keep it. So there was a huge debate about those who wanted the new Constitution and those who didn't want it. The Federalists wanted the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists didn't want the new Constitution. They felt that it was too much centralized power, right? So if we go back to this sort of illustration here, the Anti-Federalists said, no, the Constitution is too close to tyranny, right? That is far too close. And one of their biggest grievances was that there was a lack of a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights is essentially, we'll just call it a list of rights protected by the government. States had issued Bill of Rights. The state of Virginia had a Bill of Rights, so it wasn't like this idea was brand new or novel. Many of the founders thought that the Bill of Rights was not necessary, but the Anti-Federalists essentially said, look, we're not going to approve this new Constitution unless there's something like a Bill of Rights or we make some sort of other adjustments. Ultimately, the Anti-Federalists did lose this debate. They were not organized well enough. They didn't really offer a cohesive alternative to it, or besides the Bill of Rights, is what they did actually demand, and they eventually did get it. But they did lose the fight in terms of ratification. Eventually, 9 out of 13 states did approve the new Constitution, and the Constitution became the governing document of the United States, replacing the Articles of Confederation, in part due to the Federalists, specifically people like John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, who wrote the Federalist Papers. So we might call those the authors of the Fed Papers. And the Fed Papers were a series of documents, I'd say documents, which supported the new Constitution.